So hi everybody, and thanks for joining us in another episode of This Month in Procurement. I'm the host, Philip Ideson. Now, before I go into today's show and to intro Kelly, I just want to thank Traduv for sponsoring the Art of Procurement and their commitment to making procurement thought leadership really accessible to all of us that are listening today. So Traduv is a B2B platform that connects buyers and sellers across the world. Now, one of the things you can do with Traduv is build your own private network or community portal. You can do that for free. So, for example, one that brings together just your procurement team, where you can share information, post thought leadership, and just start discussions amongst your team. We're actually creating a private group just for Art of Procurement listeners within Traduv. So we'll post the podcasts, articles that we come across that we think will help you on a journey to elevate the impact of procurement. All you need to do to join is go to artofprocurement.com/Traduv and click the join for free button. On logging in, you'll be directed to a page that allows you to request access to the Art of Procurement private community, and our team will do the rest. So as a reminder, that's artofprocurement.com/Traduv. So Kelly, first of all, I want to thank you for joining me again on this month's episode of This Month in Procurement.
Hey, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks for having me back.
No problem. And a quick review of what the format is for This Month in Procurement. So we'll have a brief discussion on the pods that we published the previous month. We have a topic to discuss. It's something that we want to share, something that is top of our mind. And this month, it's actually going to be about procurement conferences, given that we're in the midst of the fall conference season. And then we'll wrap up by just sharing a little bit more about what's coming up next month. So, Kelly, let's go into this month on the pod. And the first pod that we had was with Joe Postiglione. So Joe is the CPO of the NBA. And it was really all about how the NBA thinks differently and how Joe specifically thinks differently about procurement leadership. I wonder if you could just share some of your takeaways from that pod.
Sure. So first, I think I have to say, I would like to work for you, Joe. Joe, If you're listening, I want to work for you. It's funny because so many times, you listen to these conversations and every single one of them is excellent in a different way. But Joe was different in a very specific way because he talks about a lot of self-empowerment and, feeling connected and not limiting yourself with your beliefs. And it's one of those things where you sit back and you listen to him talk, and on a subject like self-empowerment, you can tell if someone is being sincere or not. And Joe is being sincere. And just from listening to the sound of his voice, the whole time I thought to myself, I would love to work a stint there, because I think not only would I do a better job at work, I think it would help me balance things at home. I think it would make me feel calmer. And it's mostly because he has taken one of the most unusual routes to procurement. He went through coaching, and not just traditional career coaching, but very like being centered and not espousing self-limiting beliefs. And he's really continued that on in how he works with his team. So he regularly sits down and meets with them. And it's not just a review of the numbers, right? It's not just, okay, what's your list of suppliers or what RFPs do you have out right now? It really is a well-rounded conversation. It's a well-rounded approach really to not just procurement performance, but talent development. And it, I think, brings to light how we need to think about those two things, performance and talent development, more closely, more often. Did you come away with the same feeling?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me was, there's kind of this traditional mantra of you check what's going on at home at the door when you go to work.
Yes.
And what I loved about Joe is it's realism, but it's something that isn't often practiced, is the realization that there is no boundary or border really between, if things are going on at home that are challenging, that you're having struggles or whatever, you're going to bring it into work, and you can't expect people not to do that. So what you can do is see if there's any way that you can kind of help, have empathy for some of those challenges, and and be a part of helping find a solution. And the fact that he starts his one-on-ones with those conversations, that's something that, we've talked about from a learning and development perspective, that a one-on-one, typically when you go into a one-on-one, you spend, let's just say you have 30 minutes. You have this agenda, and the agenda is laid out that we're going to talk about career development, and we're going to talk about, some of the things related to you and your, like the personal side of your job. And when the reality is you spend half an hour talking about what fires you're putting out. And so changing it so that you actually start there means that it never gets forgotten. It's not talking about your career and talking about how you can be more fulfilled at work isn't the second class citizen of the one-on-one agenda. And I really like the fact that that's one of the approaches that he takes.
Well, he's clearly not checking a box.
Right.
If this is something he did for a while as his sole, professional work, he clearly enjoys sitting down with people and getting to know them. I mean, when I think back to my days of having a more traditional job, nothing is more uncomfortable than a one-on-one.
Right.
Like you sit down and everybody's like, so.
Yeah.
So, and I think that in a lot of cases is why you end up talking about the fires you're putting out or reviewing your numbers or something, because everybody wants a concrete topic to go to make that weird, uncomfortable feeling stop. And clearly Joe is a natural.
Yeah. The other thing about that I really liked about Joe is, again, it's going beyond talking and actually doing when we're thinking about how do we hire different people into procurement. So we always talk, and it's an age-old topic of finding the right people, how the skill sets are changing, and all those things that we cover on the show many, many times. And yet you look at job descriptions, and they generally haven't changed. You look at the type of people that are coming into a lot of procurement roles, and they haven't changed. They look like they're managers from an experience perspective, that old traditional career ladder. And Joe is very adamant about the EQ and the cultural, relational side of things are just as important as those technical skills, and he's actually doing it. He's not afraid to put his money where his mouth is, if you will.
No, it was absolutely fantastic. And it's funny because that's where we started this month at the beginning of September. But then we very quickly took a turn directly into automation.
Yeah.
So going from the very, self-empowered, OM kind of procurement, to talking about having a real vision for what procurement digitalization should be. And that was based on your conversation with Mahmood Shah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? Like Mahmood's punchline, if you will, of that episode, the key takeaway, I'll go there first because I think it's important in the context of what we just said about the Joe conversation, was that the most important thing to Mahmood as he has implemented a lot of automation in the source to contract process is it's all about the change management. It's all about the people still. It's not necessarily about which provider should I pick. It's how do you bring your team along for the ride, and how do you think about implementation? And again, the human side of things, that it's not all about the technology. And that was really one of the key takeaways. And Mahmood has done this many, many times. And, that was not how he started to think about automation and technology. I think a lot of us come to it with it being technology first. But the reality is that he's been successful by thinking about change and the change management side, as opposed to just looking at technology alone.
Well, and I think that kind of to stay with the Joe theme, requires a little bit of soul searching on our part, because I think it's one thing for procurement to say, oh, well, but I've never selected or implemented AI before. Blockchain is brand new. How could I possibly be experienced? However, how many times have we changed processes, changed technologies, rolled new things out? The basic elements of change management, it doesn't matter if you're swapping out, the P2P platform that you use, or if you're changing company policies about sick leave. They have different kinds of complexities, but it's the same types of organization and communication that always fix change management. And clearly, we haven't learned all of the lessons that exist to be learned in rolling out some of the early things back to the very simple days of basic e-sourcing, right? And fundamentally, none of that's going to be different. It doesn't matter if we're implementing rocket ships. If we can't handle the communication, if we can't identify and win over influencers at the right level of the organization, if we can't anticipate people that are going to be brick walls or idiosyncrasies, right? Little areas that justifiably need to be handled differently. Some of those mistakes that we all make again and again and again in a change management effort, it's time to kind of reflect back and maybe pick one. Like, don't make the communication mistake again, right? Because there's always going to be unforeseen things that relate specifically to the technology or the process or the external partner. But some of these things are universal.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'm hearing more and more is, while there's a desire to experiment, I think is the word, or pilot, do proof of concepts with a lot of these more emerging technologies, the folks who have gone through the process of doing that are all saying, like, don't just pick something for the sake of applying an automation to it.
Right.
It's not about using the technology, it's about solving a problem. And, the technology may be the solution to your problem, but don't just go looking for problems to solve by applying technology to it.
Because it won't work.
Right. And, if there's no use case or business case, or I don't know, I feel like a lot of times that we have this desire to just be using the new technology so we can say we are. Like, we've automated this, or we're using artificial intelligence in this way, or we're talking about a blockchain use case, or whatever it may be. And, all well and good to practice, if you will.
Sure.
But that's not what makes these technologies stick.
No. And it applies beyond technology. And I think the big area outside of technology that I think of with this kind of challenge is true strategic supplier relationships. It's one thing for somebody to say, oh, well, geez, Phil over there at Art of Procurement says that I need more strategic, closer relationships with my suppliers. So, okay, I pick you, Acme Manufacturing. You and we're going to go to lunch. I'm going to call you more often. I'm going to expect you to respond to my emails sooner. And, those things kind of fizzle out because just like implementing technology because everybody else seems to be talking about it isn't the right reason to invest. Selecting someone arbitrarily and saying, okay, you and let's innovate now. Let's set aside some time on Thursday to innovate.
Right.
You're better off saying, okay, what category or what area of the business or what part of the supply chain am I really, really having a problem with? Who can I go to work with to solve this in a mutually beneficial way?
Yeah.
It just like the technology has to be business case first. Something like innovation or collaboration has to be challenge first because that's what drives everybody's efforts.
Yeah, and just to add on that, it has to be something where you have advocates within your organization to do it as well. Because ultimately they're going to be the ones that are responsible. They're going to be responsive and responsible for the implementation of new innovation, whether that's business model or product or whatever it may be. And we sometimes can do that in isolation and say, hey, we've got a really innovative supplier over here. Look at them and the wonderful things they can do. But if you don't have the rest of the organization or the rest of the stakeholders within that category along for the ride, then we still try to do something on our own that we don't know the business wants or needs.
Yeah. And I think he actually calls out one critical function that procurement would be ridiculous to overlook from a partnership perspective, and that's in-house IT. We've gotten so spoiled with cloud hosting and software as a service. I mean, in the olden days, I will say, when procurement was dependent upon working with IT, and whether it was pulling data or whether it was hosting something in-house, the nature of relationship was one thing. And we've kind of moved away from that because we haven't needed as much from them. Our technology is a lot lighter. It's not hosted behind the firewall. Even these data extracts are not as onerous as they used to be. But going forward, if we are going to experiment either on a pilot level or more broadly with some of this emerging technology, we need to be very careful to involve IT, if for no other reason that if it isn't integrated properly with the rest of the technology people are using, it's not going to have any value.
Right.
And so we need to start reinvesting in that relationship. ideally before we need something from them, right? Start building the relationship back up now in recognition of what may be to come, because it also gives us the option to reboot the relationship on, tell me what you're working on. What are the IT priorities? What is our roadmap? What's going on elsewhere in the organization? It's not going to bode particularly well for us if we show up in IT one day with, like a big box of donuts saying like, hey, we want chatbots.
Yeah.
That's not going to go over particularly well.
And I can't tell you the number of times that organizations struggle to implement technology because they say, well, we don't have the IT resource to support it.
Yeah.
And that's often because we just come to them once we've decided what we want to do and say, hey, surprise, I need your help now. And you're going to need all these integration resources.
And doesn't that sound familiar? Isn't that something we complain about?
I know.
I feel like I've heard that before. I've certainly said it before. Like they always wait until they've already decided who they want to work with. And then we're just supposed to read the contract for them or something so that we make it okay. We can't turn around and do the same thing to IT.
Yeah.
So the next podcast that we moved on to in September was a conversation you had with Chris Sawchuck from the Hackett Group about some new research that they have out. And I actually have to say, as much as I was surprised about the conversation with Joe being far more enlightening, let's say, than the average conversation, Chris was hysterical. Like he was really funny. And I loved two of his points. These are his, if you're going to see the show, still go, the whole thing's worth seeing. But sort of his best 2 points were talking about procurement organizations that say, okay, we want to lead a digital transformation project. And so they start by writing a 200-page policy manual that no one is ever going to read. P.S. Not transformative.
Yeah.
And the other thing that he talks about is teams that will come to him, and I almost could see this in my mind, someone from a procurement team coming to him with a pad of paper and a pen at the ready and saying, okay, I want to be a world-class procurement leader. Yeah. What do I do first? Yeah. And he says, it's not about like step 1, put on your left shoes, step 2, put on your right. It's about world-class procurement leaders. It's not about a series of steps. It's about the way they see the world and the way they approach things. So he advises instead, go study some world-class companies. Pick a really progressive company that you admire and try to emulate the things that strike you as being the most valuable. It's as much as procurement lives in the world of process, it's not a process thing. It's a vision thing. It's a perspective thing. It's something that you just have to do and to be. You can't, there's no flow chart for becoming a world-class procurement leader.
Yeah, I was really happy to have Chris on the show. Chris, I always get to bump into Chris at conferences here, there, and everywhere. And we talk off mic quite a bit, here and there. And yeah, he's only ever been on the show once before, so I'm not sure why that was. So it was great to actually get him back on the show. It's one of those things where I just basically never invited him, and we've had an opportunity to finally bring him back. So I was really happy for Chris to join us. And we talked about this piece of research around delivering world-class performance in the digital era, which, you listen to the show, you'll find, I'll go to the show notes, there'll be a link of how to download it. I always really enjoy Hackett's research, which is where Chris is the principal of, because it's really relevant when you're thinking about procurement organizational design and capability development and all those things. And it's very specific around those areas. One of the things is that Chris talks a lot about is, while we have all these illusions isn't the right word, we have these visions of wanting to become world class, and sometimes we forget the basics. And you have to have the basics and be doing the basics as well as you possibly can before anybody will ever take you seriously, to enable you to play a bigger role. And I sometimes see a lot of us trying to skip that step, or not necessarily investing the time and the resources necessary and making sure that we have, whether that's the P2P process, whether that's being able to repeatedly and consistently drive sustainable savings, in a way that is aligned with the business. Things like that are the table stakes, but he sees a lot of companies trying to jump that step and go straight to, how we're going to expand our value proposition.
Well, but realistically speaking, too, if you really are trying to stretch your capabilities and your performance to reach the next layer, it's not a comfortable thing. I mean, it's not meant to be comfortable. If you're going to be next level at anything, there has to be some amount of discomfort because you're entering uncharted waters. And I think it's probably a very natural part of the process that you stretch and you push your team and you get to this next level, and then you kind of look back and realize like, oh, we've forgotten to put the lights on, because all of your computational power, whether it's machines or software or human beings, everything is pegged. And it becomes very hard to keep track of the small details in situations like that, where the tiny little things that should have otherwise happened without anybody giving too much thought to them, they start to fall through the cracks. And then once that happens, it doesn't matter how much advanced stuff you're either achieving or pushing towards. The fact that you're not meeting the minimum requirements, that's what people start to notice.
Right. And so the last pod that we had was with Hakan Sakir from Deutsche Telekom. And this was more specifically a case study on, how Deutsche Telekom went about thinking about digitization, but I think specifically in the source to contract process, and just some of the steps that they took along the way to try and maximize the impact of their investment in technology.
Yeah. And this picks up on one of our themes actually from last month, which is this idea around what really goes into a successful implementation. I loved what he shared about the user acceptance testing that they invested in internally. And anybody that's ever led either an acceptance testing process or just plain run an implementation, you think of that and it's like, because guess what? You're going to get feedback. And the expectation is that you're going to act on that feedback or you're going to address it in some way, but you can't skip it. As painful as it seems, the implementation will simply not go right if you don't make time for that and really truly value the input that people give you as part of that process, because that exchange does end up coming back up to play in future relationships between procurement and the people or functions that were part of the testing process.
Yeah, you'll always get, you'll always come across issues that you hadn't foreseen as well when you do that. For better or worse, it's better finding them in UAT than it is in production. But you'll always come across new issues to dive deeper into. I'm getting caught above my words here. To do some more research, to troubleshoot, whatever it may take. The challenge is always, in UAT, you'll always have also a new list of requirements. So how do you determine which of the requirements are necessary, versus which are nice to haves? And I've struggled with that, often because you're wanting to give everybody everything that they want, while it's an easy way for you to really extend an implementation process by doing so.
And sometimes it's not even about what's the ROI or how will it change the process. Sometimes it's about who's asking. Right? Because let's face it, the reality of business is that all requests for additional functionality are not the same.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And again, I guess it goes back into change management.
Yeah.
And it's part of the influencing and persuading and getting advocates on board.
That's right.
And I guess it is true that that's one of the things you look at when you determine what changes should we make to this system versus what should we just take as a nice to have. We'll capture and log it, and maybe one day in the future as part of some continuous improvement, we'll get to it then.
Absolutely. And he was also very open in talking about their future roadmap, which was kind of a nice treat because people and companies aren't always willing to discuss that. He talked about their forward-looking goals being around having a fully data-driven procurement function. He's definitely enthusiastic about the potential of chatbots.
Yeah.
And I know they're just early stages. They're thinking about these things, but the fact that he's willing to share that that's where they're headed not only gives you some sense of where some of these global leading companies are going, but it also kind of colors the way we read what they're doing today because they know what they're working towards.
Yeah. And the other thing I would just finally add to that is that they, companies like that will talk about, as Hackett did, what they're looking at going, the direction they're looking at going in. But will also openly admit that they don't have all the answers.
Yes.
And so don't be afraid not to have the answers, I guess is what I wanted to say. Because even the leading organizations who are really at the forefront of, what those world class, what Chris and Hackett would call the world class organizations, they don't have everything figured out, but they have a vision, a roadmap, a journey that they're going on, and they're investing in it.
And maybe, I guess, to even loop it back to what Mahmood Shah said about change management, it's okay to not know all the details of blockchain, for instance. That's fine. But it is not okay to not know the parts of the process and the communication effort and the influence building and bringing on board people that are going to support your project. If you've done it before, even if it was for something different, then it's not okay.
Right.
So it's about focusing less on, do I need to be an expert in blockchain before I go down this road? No, it wouldn't be reasonable to expect that. But should you be pretty proficient in communication, change management, and implementation, user acceptance testing? Yes. Yeah. Yes, that is something that procurement should bring past experiences to bear in order to have less bumps with future rollouts. So then moving on from the podcasts that we had in September, let's talk about what you've learned on a lot of the travel you did in September, because you were at quite a few conferences. And I'm actually going to be at a conference. I'm going to be at NESCON. It's the New England Supply Chain Conference and Exposition on Monday. And I'm your classic introvert. So I'm the person that if you have me to your house for a dinner party, I'm the first person to volunteer. Like, what can I do to help in the kitchen? Because networking does not, I'm not a natural schmoozer. That does not come naturally to me. So a lot of people go to these events, and granted, most people are going as full attendees, whereas you and I tend to be there as either media personalities or panelists or facilitators or something. But given that you're fresh off of a few events, I'd be interested in hearing some of your thoughts about what we can do to get the most out of attending these live events.
Yeah, so it's funny you talk about being the introvert because, I'm with you. I feel your pain.
We're both in the kitchen.
Yeah, anybody who knows me will kind of laugh at me in terms of giving advice on how to network, because I'd much rather be sat up in my hotel room probably than at the bar. And so that means it's a challenge, for me as well. And I go to, I think I've probably been to 7 or 8 conferences so far this year. And that's on pace with most years, since I've been running the podcast and doing Art of Procurement, because I get the opportunity to go to a number of these. And, while I'm there, it's great for in terms of recording and finding new guests and all those good things. So there's definitely a value in doing it, but I've had to really learn how to fill the time in between rather than just go and hide, back at in my room or at my Airbnb or whatever. So, and I think that there's really an explosion in events that's happening, large but also small. So if you're spending any time on LinkedIn, you really can't help but to notice there's some event going on somewhere, in your town, in your city, in your region. So there's no excuses for not attending. But in terms of kind of my experience, what has worked for me, and this is something that I've probably evolved over time, is, first of all, is really just focus on what you want to get out of the conference. So it's really easy because agendas are often so action-packed. It's really easy to find yourself drinking from a fire hose. And you end up with tons of tidbits that it's really hard for you to put into practice. So, as we always talk about from the learning and development perspective, it's all about taking action. So the fewer things that you focus on in terms of what you want to get out of it, the more likelihood there is that you're actually going to find enough that you can take action on it when you get back to your desk. I would say along those lines is be prepared. So, once you know what you want to get out of an event, then you can start focusing on the sessions that are going to help you meet that goal, and don't feel that you have to go and join every session to get your money's worth, because that's a really easy way to get fatigued and demotivated by the time that you come to the end of an event. That's what I would do to start with, is I'd make sure that every single time slot that was available, I had a session to go to.
Okay.
And by the end, I'd just be really tired. And as that introvert, then that would be my excuse to then go and hide.
Go back to the hotel.
Exactly. Because, I'm just exhausted because I've been in all these sessions.
Yeah.
That's really important. I think that arranging meetings ahead of time, so you often get to see in advance who's going to be there. Or, there'll be an app that's associated with the event. I found that really useful because to me, it kind of goes into one of the other elements, I would say, is it's kind of all about the quality of the conversations that you have. It's not about the quantity of the conversations. So if there's some specific people you want to meet beforehand, arranging meetings with them beforehand, a lot of people actually really, they don't mind that. They don't mind you reaching out, scheduling 10 minutes, go and meet them at the registration desk at a certain time, versus just relying on trying to bump into somebody in the corridor. Because I go and I see some attendees and they're there like handing out business cards like they're confetti. They want to get the business card in a lot of people's hands to try and meet as many new connections as possible. Again, because these events are often expensive, and that's one of your measures of ROI is how many new people did I meet? But it only takes one meaningful, impactful conversation to make it worth your while. And if you try and do too much, then you end up with a pile of business cards and a pile of new LinkedIn connections, but nothing really more material than that.
Well, and let me ask you actually about the flip side of that, because I think as much as it's hard to make decisions about which breakout session do I go to, or, where do I actually give myself permission to go meet with somebody instead of going to a keynote or a session or a panel or something, I think the forced socializing networking can be very hard. Yeah. So there's the challenge of carving out times to say, okay, I want to meet face to face with Phil. So he and I are, like you said, going to meet up and we'll go find a corner to sit in and talk. Yeah. But then there's those super artificial, like, oh, now everyone's going to go have coffee and a cookie and make friends. And it's like being back in middle school, or even lunch times. So it's this odd contrast of we are all flat out trying to connect with as many people as we can, but then they've inserted these artificial times for, now is when you play with your friends. And I don't really know any of these people. And you don't want to, hang too much on the one person that you know. You don't want to break in on conversations that seem productive, and so making the most of those coffee breaks. Any tips on those, especially tips for introverts? Oh, man, asking for a friend.
I find those so hard.
Yeah. I have a feeling everybody does. Just some people are better at dealing with it, maybe.
I mean, I think the best advice I can give is sometimes you got to do things you're not comfortable doing. And that's what you learn the most from. Like, when I started the pod, I was scared stiff of starting the podcast, and I threw myself into it knowing that if I made a commitment to do it, then I will do it. And no matter how uncomfortable it is over time, then maybe it'll be something that I learn. And I feel like there's almost like this accountability you have to give yourself that, you will meet, like write down beforehand almost, I'm going to meet X number of people, and, take those breaks and those lunches as the opportunity to do that. Because otherwise you will, again, hide. And I've done that. I think even at the ProcureCon that I went to last week, there may have been a lunch there when I went back to my hotel, grabbed some food from outside and told myself that I was really busy and I needed to get some work done. because it's hard, and if you're the introvert, it's kind of exhausting. But that's how I try and approach it, is just kind of hold myself accountable, or have me hold you accountable. Tell me the people that you're going to go meet, and you feel as though you have less excuses for skipping it.
Yeah. I also think the thing, and this is me thinking way back to my days when I was on the provider side. So when I worked for several years as the associate director of consulting at Taurus, and we would have our annual conference, and all the users would come from all around the world, and it was hundreds and hundreds of people. If you do go to a conference, it doesn't matter if it's hosted by a membership organization, if it's hosted by a university, if it's hosted by a company, right? And you're a user or prospective user. Have mercy for those people, because as hard as we all think it is traveling and attending these things, as hard as it can be to get your presentation ready or speak, if you've never lived one of these events on the other side, I mean, you've not seen your family for days because you're not allowed to go home for anything. You're not allowed to sit in a lot of cases. I remember being coached before these events. Do not sit. You are not even in the back row. You are not to be sitting. And you're constantly on, because every single person that you run into there is potentially a customer, a prospect, some kind of industry influencer. And so you can never really let your guard down. Whereas we do have the option to go find that funny little chair behind the plant in the nook and answer some emails. If you work for the organizing company and you get caught behind a plant, you are in big trouble unless you're sitting there with a customer. So have patience with those people too, if you're at these events.
It's incredible the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to make one of those events happen.
Oh my gosh.
And cost. You're talking, $500,000 plus for one of those bigger events. And it's all planned to the minute detail.
That's right.
So, in fact, I find oftentimes, when you got the event, like the events, the staff of the organizing company, it's almost like, well, our work has been done. Now it's a chance for us to relax because it took, 4 months in getting us here.
That's right.
But it's an incredible kind of commitment to pull those things together.
It definitely is.
Now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to add, just that I've found from my experiences. As you go to sessions and you go into a session, and when you realize, and you can pretty easily tell within the first 5 minutes, this isn't something for me. Maybe it was, it felt like it was clickbait, or I misunderstood the synopsis or whatever. Don't be afraid to just leave the session. I think when I first started to go to these, I would feel that, I'm just being more respectful for being there. And being there, I would then still be playing on my phone and checking my email or doing whatever. As I've spoken at a lot of events, not every session is for everybody. And I think as a speaker, I prefer, if somebody feels like this session isn't for them, that, they don't feel bad about leaving, as opposed to just sitting there and playing on their phone, because that's a bigger distraction for the speaker.
Okay.
And that's something that I do. I will leave a session fairly quickly if it's not something that I hoped it would be. Don't feel bad for that. I think the speaker probably appreciates it as well.
Do you sit near the back if you're unsure about a session?
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because that's at least less. If the guy in the middle of the front row gets up and walks out and drops his pen halfway through, that's not really good for everyone else in the session.
Yeah, I would definitely say, taking that approach does somewhat depend on where you're seating. Yeah. So that's my seating strategy is definitely to be closer to the back, so that I can have minimum disruption on others, if I do choose to leave. The final thing I wanted to say, and this isn't really as related to the situation that you have on Monday, but more generally, is that, these events can be expensive. So see what you can do to get a speaking spot. Yeah. This is particularly aimed, I think, at practitioners rather than providers. But if you have something that is interesting and insightful to share, a case study that you have where you think that your peers may take some takeaways, make a pitch to the organizer, because organizers are always looking for new, varied, interesting content from different speakers, because some of these, it can feel a little bit stale if you have the same folks all the time presenting on the same kind of topics. So don't be afraid to reach out. They're always looking for good content. And the great thing about that is that if you get selected, then, more than likely you get a free ticket at the same time.
True.
So a lot of folks whose organizations, for whatever reason, unfortunately can't afford to invest in events like conferences, if you're able to get a free ticket by speaking, it's a really good way for you to be able to get there and experience it. All right, so I know it's about time for us to be wrapping up today, so I'll just go quickly into what we have coming in October. And honestly, a little bit is in flux because we're just waiting on corporate communications of a couple of practitioner-side discussions just to give us the okay. So, some inside baseball with when we do have practitioner-side guests like CPOs on the show, we do often go through their corporate communications just to make sure they're comfortable with what's shared. And sometimes that takes longer, sometimes it's pretty quick. But we are just waiting on that before I can tell you exactly what the schedule looks like. But all being well, we have one with a head of procurement, in the pharmaceutical space. And then we have a special series coming up. So we've partnered with Officio. Officio is the largest pure play procurement consultancy in the world. And we have a 5-day series that's coming up later in the month, which is really it focuses on like the first 100-day checklist of a new CPO into their role. What are the things to focus on? How can you get some quick wins? And we have a different guest every day for a week doing a little mini pod on that topic. So really looking forward to that.
That'll be interesting.
Out. Yeah, it's kind of, we want to experiment with different types of formats. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm really interested to see how that plays out. And then towards the end of the month, the first one is going to be another October the 29th, which is a Tuesday, so 11 o'clock Eastern. You may recall we did a couple of those earlier in the year. I think we had 3 or 4 of them in the first part of the year. We now have some lined up to close out the year. Joe Yakura. So Joe is a former CPO. He's had a number of different management positions: IBM, American Express, Intercontinental Hotels, Bank of America, and then most recently at Fannie Mae. So Joe has been working with Rob Hanfield at North Carolina State University to pull together I think it's the 3rd annual supply chain data survey. So really taking a look at how do we master the supply chain data challenge. So that webinar is going to be on the 29th of October. We'll put the link to the registration page on the show notes for today, and you'll see it if you're on our email list. You'll get notifications of that webinar so that you can just join up throughout the month. So again, that's going to be on the 29th of October. So that's really what we have coming up for the rest of the month.
It's going to be a busy month.
It is, as ever. I'm on the road as well a lot, so everything keeps on coming, but it's all good fun. All right, so we're about time to wrap up for the month. So first of all, I want to thank you, Kelly, for joining me this month.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, and thanks again to everyone for listening in to this month in procurement here at the Art of Procurement. If you have any questions or comments or any topics that you're interested in us discussing, please do not hesitate to reach out. We'll, of course, be back throughout the rest of October with new podcasts, as we just talked about, that are coming out each week. And we'll be back again probably around this time next month with our next edition of This Month in Procurement. So until then, take care. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.